Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Maung Zarni, a UK-exiled Burmese dissident, scholar, and rights activist with nearly 4 decades of involvement in international affairs. He is an advisor to the US-based Genocide Watch, a fellow with the Genocide Documentation Center in Cambodia, and a member of the jury in the Permanent Peoples Tribunal on Sri Lanka and its war crimes against the Elam Tamil minority. Under the joint supervision of a leading history expert on Himmler's SS, the late Robert Louis Cole, Zarni completed his PhD in curriculum and instruction at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, with a thesis which examines Myanmar military's use of education as a tool of racist, militaristic, and nationalist propaganda amongst millions of Myanmar students. He is the co-author, along with Dr. Natalie Brinham, writing under the pen name of Alison Cowley, the pioneer research study titled The Slow-Burning Genocide of Myanmar's Rohingya, published in the Washington International Law Journal, and Reworking the Colonial-Era Indian Peril, Myanmar State-Directed Persecution of Rohingya and Other Muslims, published in the Brown Journal of World Affairs. He has taught and held research, leadership, and visiting fellowships in universities in the USA, UK, Thailand, Malaysia, and Brunei, including Georgetown University, the Rockefeller Foundation, Harvard University, Oxford, the LSE, UCL's Institute of Education, the National Louis University in Chicago, the University of Malaysia, and the University of Brunei. In August 2024 and January 2025, Zarni traveled on 2 different delegations to Gaza and the West Bank to bear witness to Israel's ongoing genocide in Palestine. I welcome Maung Zarni to Savage Minds. I learned that you and I have a shared project that we've done. I didn't know about this. I did work on Sri Lanka. I wrote, in fact, a report that investigated the human rights abuses that addressed the aporia of information that was missing from the 2011 report of the Secretary General's panel that should have been included alongside all the violations committed by the Sri Lankan government and that resulted in what is now estimated to be approximately 40,000 deaths.
No, not deaths. Murdered, not deaths. Not just deaths.
That's
murdered.
True. That's true. But of course, they were murdered, but officially speaking, deaths. And one thing I was thinking about when I noticed this in common is that there's a lot in common between what we're about to talk about with Gaza and with Sri Lanka. And I'm thinking about specifically the use of starvation, because there were several institutional problems related to malnutrition in Sri Lanka. For instance, when I did my report, one UNICEF officer told me of a study made on malnutrition in Sri Lanka. However, this study was stopped midway through because, according to my informant, the study demonstrated that malnutrition increased rather than decreased after the UNHCR presence. Sound familiar, right? And I wrote a report. Ironically, this won't surprise you at all, but I accidentally stumbled into writing the report. And this is how. And again, you won't be surprised. I went to Port-au-Prince right after the earthquake in January of 2010. I had just decided, for various reasons, to leave the university where I was teaching. It was a very toxic environment, and I decided to move on with my life at that point. I flew in to Santo Domingo to try and leave the Port-au-Prince airport open for the emergencies, right, that were needed at that point. I hitchhiked overland. As soon as I got to Port-au-Prince, I came across various operations of child trafficking, 3 within 3 weeks. Not even, I wish I were making that up. One thing that I noticed within those first few weeks is everyone knew each other. And when I say everyone knew each other, I don't mean just within the UN or from UNHCR or UNDP or FAO and another entity of the UN. I mean everyone, save the children, Terre des Hommes, Tear Fund, they all knew each other from Sri Lanka. They all had worked together after the tsunami. It was almost like the Billionaires Club, but of P5s and P3s and P2s. It was weird. There were some very good people working there, of course. There were a lot of people critical of the operations with which they were enmeshed. But I accidentally, this is when my life shifted from being a full time scholar to wearing that hat part time and being a journalist. And I ended up writing about the forced starvation that went on in the Vani, especially. And I was wondering if maybe, since we have this in common, if you could talk a bit about some of the similarities between what happened in Sri Lanka and the purposeful starvation of people and what exactly is happening in Gaza with Netanyahu doing the same.
Yeah, I was part of this a dozen member panel of jury, uh, set up by the Permanent Peoples Tribunal, headquartered in Rome, in the model of the Russell tribunals that was set up as a moral tribunal in the middle of uh, American war in Japan, in Vietnam in the 1960s, and then in the 70s, that found the United States committing war crimes that include destruction of food systems, not just carpet bombing towards the end across Indochina. What we found as the Permanent Peoples Tribunal on Sri Lanka in 2013. The first one was in Ireland a year before or 2 years before, and then the second and final tribunal on Sri Lanka held in Bremen, Germany. We found that the Sri Lanka state, Colombo, um, was in fact perpetrating a genocide. That was never really taken up by the mainstream media because at the time, uh, UK and other Western governments that we found were complicit in the Sri Lankan genocide against a particular population, Elam Tamil, that fought for self-determination, like Palestinians. Um, they did not uh, want to, use this genocide framework and the convention that already exists, to which they are state parties or signatory states. And so I think starvation, beyond the comparison between the Sri Lanka's use or Sri Lankan state actors' use of ethnic and religious minority population of Elam Tamil, um, you know, the starvation is one of the strongest indicators um, of a genocidal policy, because you see, like, the snipering, you target individuals, then like waging a war against an armed resistance, it's asymmetric warfare. Your troops are state actors, um, you know slaughter or defeat the resistance population or resistance organizations, like the Tamil Tigers or the Hamas or other Palestinian armed resistance organizations. But starvation is a different order of population destruction. It goes beyond, um, you know, a state, trying to repel the rebellion. And so starvation, the food is weaponized. That is why one of the articles of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, that, you know, spells out the creating conditions um, to destroy a population. That includes the destruction of food system or uh, disrupting or effectively stopping the flow of food into a particular area where a targeted population uh, resides, and that cuts across all scenarios that can be described as genocidal. And the most obvious example is the Nazi genocide or the Holocaust of 5 million, roughly 5 million Jewish people and another roughly 5 million non-Jews, in the Nazi occupied Europe. And so Israel is um, simply taking a leave of the Nazi regime that weaponized food as a form of collective punishment, and that's also found in all colonial situations. Famines are a result of man-made policies, whether it's done by the Nazis or the British in South Asia. Particularly the famous or the infamous famines in India, Bengal famine. That was, and then like you've got Irish famine. And these are not natural phenomena. And then you've got, the uh, the holodomor. It's a Latin word, death by hunger. That was used by Stalin in places like Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine. The holodomor, and so I think this cuts across beyond a shadow of a doubt the different pre-colonial, colonial, and World War II and contemporary cases of essentially the wars of annihilation or extermination. And obviously, as you rightly pointed out, Sri Lanka also used this method of starvation as a collective punishment of an entire population of all ages.
The fact is that you have been yourself in exile from your own country. And when we began to speak via email, you informed me how in Burma, today known as Myanmar, that you only have one name in your country. So I found that very beautiful. So I was just wondering if perhaps you could talk a bit your own exile from Myanmar, which I think people have followed some of the more recent politics around your country, but maybe not in the detail that they ought to know. And any kind of information that's relative to how you approach the situation in Gaza as a dissident from Myanmar.
Yes, I mean, to start with the name briefly, we don't have a Christian or Western naming system. Like the names. I mean, as an anthropologist, this should be of interest to you. Our names are astrologically determined. Alphabets, clusters of alphabets are believed to correspond to different star alignments in the sky. And so everyone has a given name, uh, and some may change in the course of their life as they get older and that they don't like the astrologically given name. And so they pick up something else. The wives don't take the husband's names, and the children don't take either parent's name, father or mother. So everyone has the one given name, and so I put Maung. It simply means that young Mister. Although I'm 62, but because I needed to be cataloged within the Western or international naming system, and so Maung became I go. Uh, uh, I use Maung as the technical first name and Zarni as my last name. And so, but I only have one name. So this is something that I want to use as a segue into the the larger issue. I will definitely address your question, but let me just move into the slightly different area. Um, you talk about your experience in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and the international NGOs and the other multilateral organizations operating in Port-au-Prince, and also you mentioned the same cluster of people that were active during the Sri Lankan civil war with the genocidal dimension. Um, I think that's just a institutional level. There's just like a philosophical universality of essentially what we call the Western or European civilizational norms, and there, I mean, this relates to how I approach or how I perceive the Palestinian conditions, the oppression, because in this West, recognizably Western civilizational approach to different things, good or bad, uh, the one common element over the last 500 years is that you know the lives of non-European, we're talking about non-white skin and non-Christians secondarily, um, is deemed less worthy vis-a-vis the dominant European individuals and cultures and societies. So, in because this is precisely what I've discovered throughout my almost 40 years of exilehood. Twice. First in the United States, and since 2005 in the United Kingdom, where I am today. Um, the non-European populations are not afforded uh, equal protection under either domestic or international law because our lives are deemed less. So that's why, when I see my own country's people, committing a genocide against the predominantly Muslim Rohingyas in my country of Burma by my own society that calls us Buddhist, they adopted this double standards of whose lives are worth. That is essentially the uh, the formerly colonized people of Myanmar or Burma, replicating what their former colonizers or colonial masters did to themselves. That's why I think Palestinians are in the same predicament because the international law, the civilizational norms, all of that are suspended or rendered irrelevant or non-applicable when the perpetrators are the Israeli state with the full backing of the almost entire assemble of Western institutions, including states, media, academia, or like those who control academic sector uh, and whatnot. And so that's how I, uh, find a very close resemblance between the formerly colonial regimes and how they treated us, and then independent Myanmar, using the old colonial racial and religious divide and rule within the boundaries of independent Myanmar, and how Palestinians are, subject to this heinous crime with the essentially P5 suspending any international law that has to protect Palestinian. Instead, even China and Russia abstained from this latest, colonial blueprint to divide Gaza and rule with Donald Trump's Gaza peace plan with the British Prime Minister Tony Blair. So this is the repeat of the old colonial system that we have all lived through our ancestors, if not ourselves directly. And so this is a universal crime that what we call the West has been committing over the last 500 plus years since the first European ship set sail to commodify African people as the commodities and labor for 400 years. And so this goes beyond uh, a single case. This is not an isolated case. This is part and parcel of what we have been told uh, um, is the Western civilization centered in Europe.
I've been dealing online with a lot of what are clearly genocide deniers. These are people who have made accusations that the images we are seeing on our mobile phones, on our computer screens, on our television sets are part of Hollywood. I laughed at these people. It's really hard to take these people seriously, much less wonder how they're not inside of a padded cell. There is an alarming, I mean, to me, one person's too much, but there is an alarmingly high number of people in Great Britain, even a higher percentage, as recent data seems to suggest from polls both within the US and Great Britain, that there are even more genocide supporters on the pseudo left, the Guardian reading left, but those aren't leftists, than there are in the States. We've seen something also for the first time in my lifetime, a turnaround in popular support for Israel by right-wing youth, meaning people generally under the age of 30 in the US. This is shifting vastly, very quickly. I'm doing an ethnography of feminists, and the genocidal feminists are too many. Every time I read their screed, I'm like, don't respond, don't respond, don't respond. You think that you can change hearts and minds with facts, but then they tell you this is Hollywood. We've been set up. So, Zarni, you have traveled to Gaza in 2 different delegations. I would like, if you could please, to tell us about what you witnessed and if you saw, and if what you saw measures up to genocide, or if, as many people will say, you were just shown specific things to brainwash you and that you were given a live version of Hollywood. Can you tell our audience about both trips and what you saw?
Yes, I went to the occupied Palestine twice. Last year, in August and early part of September, I was with a group of about 30 interfaith leaders, primarily from the United States, rabbis, for ceasefire, based around the New York and San Francisco, and the places where there were good pockets of Jewish Americans who are outraged by what Israel has been doing, which is committing a full-scale genocide in their name. And then there are also, Methodist and Catholic clergy, and also Catholic workers, activists who form half of that delegation. And there were a couple of activists of Indian ancestry in the U.S. and also UK. And then there was myself, as a Buddhist, although I'm not a religious person at all, but culturally and philosophically, I was raised in a Buddhist Myanmar, and so I went there as essentially a token Buddhist. But I also wanted to show that this issue of the destruction of Palestinian people is a concern for all groups, whether we are faith-based or secular or radical atheists, what have you. This is a universal concern as a human being. So that was my first trip, and the second trip was again 6 months or 5 months later in January. I took a group of international poets and scholars, a small group, about 10 from about 6 different countries, to essentially bear witness and to learn firsthand, on the ground, talking to Palestinians on the streets, observing how the Israelis interact, if at all, with the Palestinian inside apartheid Israel. There's 1.5 million Palestinians who were considered 1948 Palestinians, who they were for one reason or other trapped or chose not to run away, and then they were absorbed into the newly established European implant Zionist entity called Israel. Since 1948 May. So these were like Israeli Arabs, so Palestinians, 1.5 million of them. I met some of the most prominent the scholars and activists, from that group, and also in my first trip in September, no, actually end of August, we traveled to the southernmost uh, part of Gaza. It's called Kerem Shalom crossing. There were 4 crossings from the Israeli side. There's also another crossing from the Egyptian side. It's called Rafah crossing from the Rafah city, the Egyptian city, on the Egyptian side. And so we went to this southernmost crossing in Gaza, and we saw Israeli troops with armored vehicles, the tanks, supplied by the Germans, and possibly by the Americans, but the going in and out of their military roads into Gaza. The nearest city inside Gaza from where we were was Rafah city, where Yahya Sinwar, the head of the Palestinian resistance group Hamas, fought till his death. We saw that clip on the that Israeli put out on social media platforms. And so we were there. I heard loud explosions from about 1 kilometer or maybe a little bit farther from where we were. Where we were was a vast empty parking lot where normally, the supply trucks would wait, supply trucks from UNRWA, the UN agency for the Palestinian refugees. They will wait to get in, and it was, massive trucks. The you know the parking lot is so big that that you could see dozens of like lorries or trucks could easily be parked there. We only saw less than 10 trucks in a span of like 50 minutes or so where we were, and the IDF approached us, and then one of our hosts from the Liberation Theology Center based in Jerusalem handled the IDF. And so because most of the delegates were the Americans, the clergy and rabbis. So we were sort of left undisturbed. We did our peace vigil while the Israeli drones and tanks were firing artilleries or dropping bombs on the neighborhoods in Rafah city. I mean, this was like surreal. And then we also stopped in one of the kibbutz near where Nova Music Festival took place. And as you know, like the Israeli IDF, the Palestinians call IDF IOF, Israeli Occupation Force, as a matter of factly, and the IDF was reportedly killing the Israeli the music festival goers, and like destroying dozens of cars in that desert kibbutz where the rock concert was happening, just literally a short distance away from the killing fields of Gaza, right? So this is IDF killing its own people based on the Israeli army doctrine that we would rather kill our own people and let the Palestinian resistance take them as hostages. And so we stop at that kibbutz to have a dialogue with, a small number of the kibbutz residents and Israeli rabbis for human rights. And there were a couple of Palestinian Americans who were born in Jerusalem and then migrated as young girls to the United States. They refused to get off the coach to meet with the Israelis to have a dialogue. And I stayed on the coach with these two sisters from Michigan and from Washington, D.C., Palestinians, and who had never been to any of these areas until they had this American passport, and although they were born in Palestine. And so it's really surreal because from that kibbutzin, we could also hear loud explosions. The Israelis dropping bombs from the F-35, or launching grenade launchers or whatever weapons they're using. Massive explosions we were hearing. So I stayed on the bus with them as an act of solidarity because they felt that it was like talking to any type of like the Zionists that tried to explain their concern for what was happening was like having a cup of tea with SS officers while the crematorians were still working full steam and gas chambers were operating 24/7. So then, like moving to to the non-directly genocidal areas such as Ramallah, where the Palestinian Authority is headquartered, or like East Jerusalem, where most of the indigenous Palestinian neighborhoods are under constant threat of demolition. Then we travel to farmlands that are under constant attack or threats of attack by settlers. Then most of the settlers, who numbered about 700,000, were Americans and Canadians and Australians. It's interesting that when we say settlers, we're talking about land thieves that are subsidized by the American money and also protected by the state of Israel. I also took opportunities to go and join the Israeli protest. I mean, when I say Israeli, I'm talking about Israeli Jewish citizens, because there are two types of Israelis. One is Israeli Palestinian citizens, and then the majority Israeli Jewish citizens. And so there was a massive protest, and including blocking one of the arteries in downtown Tel Aviv, just in front of the Ministry of Defense. There are thousands of Israelis came out not to oppose the genocide that Israel or their government of Netanyahu was committing, but to bring back the hostages. The 200 plus hostages at the time were alive. We're talking about September of 2024, last year. And so, I would strike up conversation with some of these protesters demanding that Netanyahu make a deal and bring back the Israeli hostages. And also, I would talk to people, on the tram. I would talk to people on the public transport, and just to get a sense of how not simply what Israel as a state and IDF are doing to the Palestinians in Gaza, or how they view them, those in the West Bank, that is made up of East Jerusalem and Ramallah, and Hebron, the ancient city. And so I have had, just like other members of the delegation, freedom to discover on our own, absolutely non-scheduled, non-choreographed, by our Palestinian host, which is there's a Liberation Theology Center called Sabil, extremely highly reputable, theologians that are involved in, using Christianity, as it should be, as a basis for their own liberation struggle. And so, we also met with some of the best known Christian leaders, including Reverend Dr. Munta Isaac, and also we march along with local Palestinian activists, religious leaders, community organizers, in support of the one family whose ancestral farmland just outside of Jerusalem was taken over by Israeli military. So you see in Israel, I am increasingly of the view, after having visited there twice, and also having spoken with the different Israelis on the streets, as well as having spoken with the Palestinians from different walks of life, including Bedouin villagers who are under constant attack, not just a threat these days, attack by the Israeli um, settlers. I am convinced that not just the Gaza is, but also the rest of the occupied territories, East Jerusalem and Ramallah, and a few other predominantly Palestinian cities are under serious threat of a genocidal destruction. And so people pay attention to, rightly so, what Israel has been doing for the last 2 years against the 2.3 million Palestinian under medieval siege inside Gaza, which is only like a 25, 26, or 28 miles in length, a narrow region. It's really an open prison. But the rest of the occupied territories of Palestine are also vast open prisons with, 1,000-kilometer long wall. We're talking not about walls that we see in European, not even like medieval wall cities. Israeli walls are massive and super tall, with sniper towers, panopticons, in different places, and the walls is called separation wall. And actually, I would go, so far as to say that the wall is part of the genocidal destruction of the Palestinian population. The wall is an instrument for the state of Israel to perpetrate what the late Johann Galton called structural violence, to limit the the flow of life's essentials into the population, because the wall obviously will have like checkpoints and gates. Villages are also what do you call it, prevented from freedom of movement. And so the wall is a part and parcel of Israelis' long-term institutionalized and slow-paced genocide outside of Gaza. So we're talking about multiple methodologies of population destruction, gradually. So that's why some of the people that we met in places like Hebron, the old city of Hebron, a well-known Palestinian activist, his name is Isa Amro. He told us that simply existing on their own ancestral land itself is an act of resistance. You don't have to throw stones at the IDF checkpoints. You don't have to take up arms. The fact that you are refusing to vacate your ancestral home itself is an act of resistance. So we're looking at 7 million Palestinians who refuse to leave their ancestral land. That we're talking about 7 million Palestinians resisting in multiple ways against this vast system of repression, colonial occupation set up by the state of Israel over the last 70 plus years, with the financial backing, diplomatic cover, media propaganda, and supply of weapons from countries like Germany, Canada, the United Kingdom, Italy, Australia. So I think what we are seeing is essentially a you know the West collective genocide spearheaded by Israel. So you would be aware that Melanie Phillips, the well-known, or I should say, the infamous, a Jewish supremacist columnist for the Times of London, just recently in New York City, openly inciting the Jewish American audience that Israel is still being soft in Gaza because Israel uses the terminology of mowing the lawn. Mowing the lawn. Mowing the lawn is not enough. It is too soft and too liberal. And said Melanie Phillips to the cheering audience at the Museum of Jewish Heritage at a conference dubbed Rage Against Hate. But what she was saying is that we need to return to the Hebrew Bible and use Hebrew Bible as a blueprint for killing and defeating any enemies of Israel in Palestine, because Palestine doesn't exist. Palestinians don't exist, and the land of Palestine is all for the Jews and no one else, and not Christians, not Muslims, nobody else. And so this is a full-scale incitement to genocide by a well-known British Jewish citizen. And Keir Starmer, the government, does nothing because the Britain is a signatory state or state party, as lawyers would call it, to the Genocide Convention. The convention requires that signatory states take legal action against anyone or any organization that openly incite genocide. This is simply beyond hate speech. This is what Melanie Phillips said openly in New York City is an incitement to further genocide because Israel is not committing a hard genocide. Israel needs to, switch gear and start killing Palestinians openly, not just in Gaza, all across the historic Palestine. And so, this we were to talk about the Palestine action and its appeal that is happening yesterday and today, and also on the 2nd of December at the British High Court. And here we are, the regime of a pseudo Labour government of Keir Starmer is going after pensioners, from all walks of life, including the retired British Army or Air Force personnel who stand up and say, we oppose genocide and we support Palestine action. Utterly innocent, non-violent acts of genocide opposition, and yet, letting someone like Melanie Phillips and her ilk to openly incite further genocide by Israel. This is where we are today. And this is not an isolated case in Britain. If you look at all the European states, or most of them, with the exception of Ireland and Spain, and European colonial offshoots built through genocides, such as Canada, USA, Australia, all these, powerful and rich Western states built through genocides and colonial annexation over centuries, they are not simply complicit, they are directly participating in Israel's genocide, even at the expense of long established, democratic institutions and traditions for their own people on their own soil in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in UK, in Germany, of all states. So this is actually imperialist civilizational genocide. Yeah, before Christian Europe was persecuting the Jewish people, the religious community over 1,000 years, going back to Magna Carta, to the early 13th century. The Jews were singled out as people that need to be contained, that need to be excluded and discriminated against. So what is happening is far worse than what was happening in Nazi Germany and the Nazi occupied Europe for a simple reason.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Last year, you were not only nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Northern Irish peace activist myriad Maguire, who was herself a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1976, but you were cited in an Andalou English article where you said that this was a repeat of Auschwitz and a collective white imperialist man's genocide. I had a laugh, of course, because I thought, oh, the IHRA is going to come after you because you broke the rule. You made a comparison between what Israel is doing and the Holocaust. But let's take a look at how this was basically astroturfed into existence. We know about the lies, babies in ovens and rapes that have all been completely unfounded. Investigations have shown no evidence for this. In fact, we had on the show the Special Rapporteur for Women and Girls, Reem Al-Salam, who spoke about this and then was mobbed on Twitter for having spoken out about this. And just this week in Italy, I'm very disturbed by these kinds of laws, but there was a law that was agreed upon within Parliament that people convicted of femicide would serve life sentences. But you and I both know who will be guilty of femicide because it won't be the white dude. And even though if you ask Grok or AI about this, they'll claim that it's equally persecuted. Femicide was a designation used in anthropology to refer to certain types of deaths. And albeit white anthropologists gave it this name because, as you mentioned, the famine in Bengal was not only ignored by the West, it was pretty much ignored by most Western journalists and publications, just as we're seeing all over again what happened with the current genocide in Gaza, how it's been reported. Even then, there's been a miracle with some of the coverage as well, where we're given nightly Q&As by Piers Morgan. Are you against Hamas? That was going on for a good year and a half. But now Piers Morgan has become quite cognizant. He's been covering this every day pretty much for years now, that he is now pretty much on the side of planet reality where he sees a genocide. He spoke about the starvation. He is now critical of people on the right who, and some on the neoliberal Guardian left, who are unable to evoke the sentence, there is a genocide in progress. It has become a political tool all over again. Now, I looked up this article on you from last April in the Turkish publication that I referred to earlier, and then I thought about this, and I was thinking, what happened during the Holocaust? Well, we know what happened during the Holocaust because there was a book published at the beginning of the 2000s, I believe 2005, where a former New York Times and New Yorker journalist, Laura Leff, wrote a book about this very subject. And she found very little reporting on the Holocaust. And when the New York Times and the Telegraph did report on the Holocaust, page six, here's a headline. Germans murder 700,000 Jews in Poland. Traveling gas chambers. More than 700,000 Polish Jews have been slaughtered by the Germans in the greatest massacre in the world's history. First sentence, page 6, okay? Now, people who are denying the genocide in Gaza because they're also perhaps reading publications which feature it on page 6. I mean, go today to the BBC. I have no words for what the BBC does here. I'm on the BBC's webpage. It's revolting. It reads like Hola, Hello Magazine. You get a lot of PR over celebrities. Cats became our companions way later than you think. You get, of course, a follow-up to the tragic fire in Hong Kong. But there are very few mentions today on the genocide. One story further down on the front page, Israeli troops killed 2 Palestinians after they appear to surrender. No mention that the UN has been very critical of this. So we're being fed this drip, drip, drip of absolute lies by most of the media. I don't understand why people in the UK are not protesting the license fees. The BBC should be out of business. The reporting on this genocide has been nothing less than vomitacious. Of course you have people that say, oh, but Israel has a right to exist. Why are they saying this? Because they're being presented with a false story. Going back to what you said about the festival, the music festival. People would say to me, but they had a right to have their music festival. And I would say, why on earth would you hold a rave directly outside of a concentration camp? Why is nobody talking about that? And sure enough, people get upset. They go back to blaming Hamas. But what you said, that this is a repeat of Auschwitz, will get you on the blacklist of the AHRA. In addition to, you will be called an anti-Semite. Yet I think the problem with our perception, when I say our, those of us who were born and raised in the West, brought up on Steven Spielberg films that show one kind of horror, is that we're not shown the other. Now, if you recall, The Killing Fields won an Oscar way back. And The Killing Fields dealt with the horrors that were only brought to the public attention through journalism. Is it that Westerners can only digest the kind of Steven Spielberg or Killing Fields films that win Oscars, and that's that? We draw a line under it. We will deal with it as artifice, as a fictional work, but representing a lot of reality? Or are we at this stage in our collective humanity that now we claim, these people claiming to be for Israel and that Zionism is not racism and there's no murder of Palestinians and that this was all created by Hamas. These very people are the ones who would accuse us of denying a genocide that I don't think any of us would deny the Holocaust. I think you'd be insane to deny that, or the Holodomor, or many of the ongoing genocides we've lived through since we were born. You and I are only a few years apart in age. I'm very frustrated by the fact that I have to wake up not only to the genocide, but Westerners, mostly white Westerners, who refuse to see that this is a genocide. I have a certain repulsion towards these people at this point, because I think it was okay to be questioning if it was a genocide in the first days because you haven't read a thing and you have no knowledge on the subject. But now we've had more years on this than we have lockdown. And remember, these people were overnight immunologists back in 2020. They don't seem to have mastered the same level of immunology and virology in terms of Middle East studies and history. What do you think's going on there?
Well, firstly, I've been in activism since I was 14 or 15, back in Myanmar during the socialist dictatorship, so-called, actually a military dictatorship with a veneer of socialism, right? So then in terms of international activism, I've been doing it since around 1988, and so that's almost 40 years. And I've had death threats and whatnot, over the years. And I close my eyes, and the way to deal with the natural, the fear of one's own demise, death, by unnatural means like murder and whatnot. And so I am not afraid to be cancelled. I'm not afraid to lose career, because precisely because I want to be able to speak out against this kind of blatant set of lies coordinated by the powerful, and also the cruel and heinous crimes against the different human communities. I chose not to have a career as such. You mentioned you left academia and do journalism independently and otherwise. I made the similar decision, like very consciously. The all I need is a roof on my head, and a small amount of stipend to pay bills and feed my family and myself, and the rest, like vulnerable, physical threats, and reputational damage. I don't care. Call me anything. What I care is that as an intellectual and a dissident, my duty is to tell it like it is, to write about, speak about what I see through my trained scholarly eyes, and what I see in Gaza and Palestine is, you know, it's a total repeat of the Nazi genocide. The Moshe Yaalon, former defense minister in the previous Netanyahu cabinet and former head of the Israeli Defense Force and a retired general, Moshe Yaalon, put it in the most succinct way. In his words in Hebrew, that was transcribed by Katie Halper in the Katie Halper show. Israel is pursuing, these are his words, Mein Kampf in reverse, right? Think about it. This is the big picture. Israel is pursuing Hitler's Mein Kampf in reverse with the Jewish supremacists, doing what the Nazis did to the Jewish population under Nazi occupation in Europe back in the late 1930s and 40s until Hitler's downfall in 1945. And so this is chilling. The Israel, the official state for the Jewish people, is carrying out the Holocaust 2.0 in the name of the Jewish people, not just in Israel, around the world. So this is the big picture. And when I gave the interview to Anadolu News Agency in the spring of 2024, I had not even set my foot on the soil of the occupied Palestinian territories. But because, I did my PhD under the supervision, a joint supervision of a former U.S. military intelligence officer by the name of Robert Louis Cale, who interrogated mid-level surrendered SS officers immediately after the Nazi regime collapsed in 1945. He was posted to Germany to fight the Nazi, because he was a first generation German American in Wisconsin. He was fluent in German, and so he was assigned to interrogate SS officer. I visit, and so that was my intellectual lineage. I was looking at how Nazi Germany used propaganda to turn the society into a Nazi society. I was using that framework to understand how Myanmar military used propaganda to brainwash us, the average Myanmar citizens, from kindergarten all the way to universities, to turn us into a Islamophobic, racist, militaristic, colonialist Myanmar citizens. So I had that framework, and in addition, I visited, at least 10 Nazi concentration camps, over the last 20 years. That I produced or co-produced a film about Auschwitz for the Burmese activists. I conducted, 3 years genocide education tours in the killing fields in Cambodia to try to sensitize Myanmar citizens what genocide is and why we must oppose at all costs to ourselves when it's done by our own country in our own names. So I was confident that what Israel was doing is really what the Nazis did to the Jewish and non-Jewish populations all across Nazi-occupied Europe. What is happening in terms of how the Western media, and we're talking about legacy media here, like BBC, CNN, New York Times, the Times, like Deutsche Valley, France 24, whatever, you name it, the entire ecosystem of corporate and public legacy media is performing what Ministry of Public Enlightenment under Joseph Goebbels did for the Hitlerite physical destruction of the European Jewry. That is why you don't see this in the headlines. Back in early 1940s or mid 1940s, early 1940s, there was this report by the Polish exiled government based in London. It was entitled, "London has been informed about Auschwitz." There was a half a dozen escapees from Auschwitz, Polish and Jewish inmates, who wrote up this report and describing what the Nazis were doing to 1 million Jews and others, inmates in Auschwitz. And London ignored it. London, meaning the British government, ignored this report because it was written by 5 people who witnessed and suffer what the Nazis were doing. And so this is just a repeat. But this time, what's different is that the Israel and the Zionist Jews, not all Jews. This is not a Jewish issue. This is a Zionist issue. Zionism is considered now by people like Gideon Levy, one of the most courageous and the Israeli Jewish journalist with impeccable integrity. He said Zionism is fascism. So what we are seeing is Western white imperialist states, not all white people. When you look at millions of people marching across European cities, majority of them are white citizens, just like us, brown, whatever. They are human, fully human, with conscience and compassion for what Palestinians are going through. So when I use the word white imperialist, I mean precisely that. White imperialist elite and ruling class directly participating in this the genocide. But this time, what's different from Nazi genocide and Israel's genocide? What we are seeing is the merging of the so-called Judeo tradition and Christian tradition. And then obviously, like, these are not like Judeo-Christian values of love and truth and, like, justice. This is the manipulation of Judaism as a faith system and Christianity as a faith system. So that's why, if I don't know if you're aware, Hamid Davashi, the endowed chair at the Columbia University in the comparative literature in New York, he just put out a book a few months ago called After Savagery. He said when Israeli President Isaac Herzog said, "We are fighting for the Judeo-Christian civilization." And his argument was that what we call the West, the white imperialist West that invented transatlantic slave trade and the racial capitalism of which we are all subject to for the last 500 years, is really the essence of this so-called Western civilization. So what we are seeing is no different from what Columbus and others have done to the so-called New World, wiping out indigenous population for want of their land, gold, copper, diamonds, fertile land, what have you. So we are not seeing anything different that you and I, from formerly colonial or European colonized societies, have not learned or experienced. That is why I am so passionate about this issue, because this is what we as Myanmar or Burmese people lived through for 120 years under the British colonization. And as a South Asian descendant, I know you can relate to this. That is why, when Melanie Phillips, in New York City, mentioned that Israel has been now seen as a threat or enemy against the humanity, that is a Freudian slip. You know why? Because what we have come to call as the West, it's not just the Israel problem. This is the Western civilizational problem. After 500 years, we have to break the taboo and call things by their name. The West today is enemy of humanity.
This is what Hamid Dabashi's book gets at, in fact. And he says that the quintessence of the West is itself the state of Israel.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I've been saying Israel is not doing anything the West has not done. That is why, there is such a philosophical, ideological infinity between what really is savage states. I know, you use the savage minds as anthropological satire. I think,
Yeah.
but I think Africa has been, or anything outside of European continent geographically, and then European offshoots, has been described as, less than civilized, basically savages, right? Heathens and savages. We are not touched by the gospel. All of that. But I mean, we have 500 years of solid historical and contemporaneous evidence to establish that Europe and the imperialist white ruling class, all the way to Peter Thiel, who runs Palantir, that's South African, and then like Elon Musk, all of these, American and South African oligarchs um, who form the money basis or money class for the political imperialists who run political institutions. They are the savages. They are class A war criminals. If, you know, there's ever been a power inversion, these are the white men who will find themselves in the dock like a Nuremberg sort of trials. So I mean, like, and when the oppressed strike back, we are labeled and named all kinds of names. Dacoits, the Indian terms, the terrorists, petty criminals, all kinds of names that deprive us of any basis morally, spiritually, for our resistance. Yeah. Because this Western civilization is so fragile, philosophically, spiritually, morally, that it cannot afford to allow any of us to have a proper freedom of speech, proper association, the right to protest, the right to life. If a state, if a system of power feels so fragile that it has to crush 84-year-old pensioner in the middle of London holding this sign, I oppose genocide and I support Palestine action. That system is extremely vulnerable to truth. Yeah. So we are living, in my view, through the last phase of Western imperialism. I was raised in a Buddhist philosophical tradition. Everything has an expiry date, including Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist, we were told. And so, in my view, what we are living the end of Western imperialism slash civilization.
I launched Savage Minds during lockdown because of my getting from leftist publications, by the way, pushback on criticism of lockdown. And I began to see, I already knew it from my work before with the feminists, that the left and the right were collapsed already, but it was more defined during lockdown. And also because I was really shocked, to be honest with you, to see Tucker Carlson covering class-based issues during lockdown and the poverty that people were facing because of lockdown. And mind you, Jacobin was running pieces that were pro-lockdown. So was The Nation. So we're in this very strange world right now where we're finding a lot of right-wing anti-genocide folks at our side. And a lot of people who I have in real life friends, I mean, this is really sad, who supported the global war on terror after 9/11. And I was living in Montreal, but I was really freaked out every time I'd come down to New York, because I was living between New York and Montreal for many years. And I was thinking, what's going on? How is it that people I thought were quote unquote progressive, quote unquote on the right side of history, are sustaining this? And I worked on a project at the time on the disappearance of Muslim men post 9/11. It was really disturbing to me when friends would say to me, Zarni, are you thinking of becoming Muslim? And I'm like, what? In all the years I've been doing work in Central America, South America, you didn't ask me if I was becoming Catholic, right? This is it. And you see this as an immigrant. I'm in Italy. I'm an immigrant here. And I see the racism here. They passed a law in Italy this week committing to lifetime prison sentences for murderers of women that were deemed femicide. Now, I have a whole problem with femicide as I do with hate speech. I think these are very dangerous. They're not just slippery slopes to censorship, but they're slippery slopes to racism, because we know that femicide is used all the time to refer to, look what happens in that, name the Muslim country or the Muslim community, right? That's how it's used, and we know it. But in Italy, they're starting to call everything femicide. But it was a crime of passion. And I'm like, most people murdered across the world are men. But most of the people killing are men, they say. And I'm like, of course, because of the physical strength. It's like saying not enough men give birth. There's a physical factor in why physical altercations end in violence. But when you ask these same people to discuss, and I have, the very high rates of domestic violence amongst lesbian couples, they stay silent. The feminists have nothing to say. And study after study shows that these rates of violence are higher than in heterosexual couples. Yeah? And they will say nothing. And the reason why I mention all this is because in Italy, I had to show ID because some racist person saw my son and didn't put together that he was with me or whatnot. She probably didn't like that he was sitting a little too close to a Benetton store entrance, right? But that's the level of racism that exists in Italy still. And yet, when you go to feminist groups here, and they're all over their websites, it's embarrassing. I'm embarrassed for these women that all they can do is talk about the chador, the hijab, and Bollywood. They reject that there is a genocide ongoing in Gaza, and then they go to that chorus of, but Hamas, but Hamas. It's so ignorant. I mean, I am embarrassed for them because this is sheer stupidity and willing ignorance. They have an internet connection. I know because I see their ridiculous posts on the chador. Do they ever try to get at why women in Italy don't have access to, let's say, enough childcare, or that lower income women in Italy have difficulty re-entering the job market because of the high costs of childcare? Where were these women during lockdown when we were expected to do DAD, didattica alla distanza, which is homeschooling, while working full-time? They were nowhere. But let's talk about the chador, right? It's insane, Zanni.
Yeah, I mean, like there are two things. Very briefly, I think like one is the the imperialism, colonialism as a system of power and exploitation. The based on this like hierarchy of human populations on the basis of skin colors and faith and whatnot, right? And then the other one is the what you're describing, the individual white skinned people, and I have to say though, there are also people like Priti Patel and and others who came from a non-white background and thoroughly wired in the colonial mindset. And so as I mean, Fanon say, there's a colonialist and colonialism the is devoid of thinking, of vision, of wisdom for humans. It essentially, what you were talking about is like, utterly unthinking people, a thinking feminist, irrespective of skin color or national background, would see things for what they are. If they see a genocide, they say this is genocide, unacceptable, right? One is that knowing a crime is being committed, and the other one is having the political will to oppose it, and and the third is having a principle to hold that crime against. And so as Frantz Fanon said, colonialism is not a thinking machine. I have a quote here. It is naked violence, and it only gives in when confronted with greater violence. I mean, I'm not talking about like violence in the physical sense, but I'm talking about the need to confront these lies. You talk about like upside down world. We are living in a discursive world that is based on Kafkaesque absurdity and Orwellian, double speak. That is why people are so confused, and that is why it's so important to not fear any accusation, to not fear any legal action, because after all, the law is a tool for the white masters, international law, domestic law, whatever. And these came about as a result of resistance and struggles for centuries. And as black and lesbian feminist Audre Lorde said, masters' tools are not going to dismantle master's house. That is why we need to be, openly radical and revolutionaries in our thinking and in our articulation. If we cannot be radical and revolutionary, that is to say, if we cannot be 100% truthful and honest, irrespective of consequences, we cannot change this world. And but that the silver lining is the masters has lost control of the narrative. That is why they are, desperate in the way they are handling groups like Palestine Action or any non-violent opposition to the empire and its, centuries of crimes. And Israel is its last episode. Let's make it the last episode.
Yes, I think they miscalculated their ability to control the internet, and it's turned out to be the worst news for them. Even though, as you know, you have Bibi multiplying 20 times the investment in PR online and buying up Instagrammers and all these representatives who can tout the Hasbara nonsense. And we see it. As soon as Candace Owens started supporting the Gazans, we knew that something was going to turn over. And it has. They went right after her. They've gone after Tucker Carlson because they're saying, as Christians, we don't support genocide. How radical a statement is that? This is a crazy time because there are people who actually think that she and Tucker are right wing. They're Guardian readers who support Melanie Phillips and Israel. It's insane. They refuse to accept that Zionism is racism. And again, this is pure ignorance. I've had a rabbi on the show who has talked in detail. He wrote a huge book that should have been maybe 4 books. It's that big, that details the history of Zionism. But you can read about it. Loads of American Jews were criticizing Zionism back in the 19th century. This is absolutely the worst of racist propaganda. And what makes it the worst is at least during de Klerk's rule of South Africa, he knew his time was up. There were boycotts, people divesting in Citibank. You had the massive force of Irish unions that really toppled it. And people knew that what happened to Stephen Biko, Nelson Mandela, and hundreds others was wrong. And it ended. You didn't have people saying, well, we're going to stop the apartheid if Mandela disbands his party, right? No, they got into office. But we're hearing this about Hamas. It's like, thank God for Hamas. They don't even understand the basics of resistance politics, these people. This is what kills me. Because if they were the ones right now sleeping under a thin sheet of plastic as the rains pour onto these badly, if at all, insulated tents, they would be supporting Hamas too. Any of us would. It's absolutely bonkers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I think like I personally draws inspirations for from essentially 400 years of black resistance. And like slavery wasn't abolished because like the good Christians in London started abolitionist movement, or John Brown in in West Virginia, took up arm to overthrow the slave regime in the United States. So the enslaved Africans had to resist us by all means necessary for centuries, including jumping off the ship instead of allowing themselves to be enslaved somewhere, far away from African continent. And so I keep the faith, as intellectuals and as radicals, we cannot afford to lose hope, and we have to look at past struggles, and we might not see the light at the end of the tunnel at this moment. However, we have to have faith in we the resistors, and it's not even like left right feminist a non-feminist issue. This is really a humanity versus enemies of humanity. And we are confronted with enemies of humanity. And I welcome Candace Owens, as much as I welcome like Mehdi Hassan, Tucker Carlson. At the end of the day, we only have other human beings, because the systems that are set up are not for us. That's for sucking the planet and humanity dry for a dime. So keep the faith.